Welcome to the History of North America. I'm Mark Vinette. Our narrative takes us to Florida and the French Protestant Huguenot colonists in 1564. The Saturiwa were a Timucua chiefdom centered on the mouth of the St. Johns River in what is now Jacksonville, Florida. They were the largest and best attested chiefdom of the Timucua subgroup known as the Mocama, who spoke the Mocama dialect of Timucuan and lived in the coastal areas of present-day northern Florida and southeastern Georgia. One of the 500 indigenous nations and cultures that blanketed North America, they were a prominent political force in the early days of European settlement in Florida, forging friendly relations and alliances with the French Huguenot settlers at Fort Caroline in Saturiwa territory. The Saturiwa are so called after their chief at the time of contact with the Europeans, Saturiwa. At that time, the chief's main village was located on the south bank of the St. Johns River, and he was sovereign over 30 other chiefs and their villages. Eric Yanis of the Other States of America podcast has graciously agreed to share his telling of this incredible story.
Welcome back to the tale of French Florida. When the French landed and Laudonnière stepped off the boat, he met a native he seems to have known from his previous expedition, a great leader of a Timucuan chiefdom named Satiriwa, or Satiriwa, or Satiriba. The sources vary, and so my pronunciation will too. But we have to give the French some credit here, because the English or the Dutch, when they would meet a native leader, would just give them a name they were more familiar with. The Dutch might choose Hendrik, and the English might choose Henry. The French at least tried to address people by their actual names. It's likely that Chief Satiriwa saw the French coming, had advance warning of some type, and so went to the pillar to draw their attention. He was a smart man, and it seems as if he took the French to a nearby village that was under his control. Again, the Timucua may have numbered 100,000, but they were broken up into many smaller chiefdoms of as many as 35 villages each. They were not a united ethnic group. At this point, Laudonnière and Satiriwa began trading metal objects. The Timucua, of course, want manufactured metal objects, like axes, knives, things like that, whereas the Timucua had for the French raw ores. They had silver ingots. And now Laudonnière, of course, is very interested in where this came from. And Satiriwa said, well, there's lots of this further to the west, and this is taken from the hills that are in possession of my enemies. And so if you make an alliance with me, we can go to war together, and I'll get you tons of this stuff. Satiriwa then took Laudonnière by the hand and told him about gold. Gold that was in possession of all his enemies. He was the key to getting all the mineral wealth the French would ever want. If only Laudonnière would agree to form an alliance with him. Here again we see an example of when the Native Americans are acting contrary to stereotypes about Native Americans. Satiriwa and the Timucua, they knew Europeans. The Spanish had been through a number of times. They were well aware of the advantages to European technology. They were well aware of what the Europeans desired, and were willing to use all of these things to their advantage, whether they had to lie about it or not. In this case, the Timucua were not the helpless and ignorant but noble people who were being taken advantage of. The French were the one who took the bait, hook, line, and sinker. Laudonnière agreed on the spot. Yes, we will form an alliance.
Satiriwa was delighted, and declared that if he kept his word, he should have gold and silver to his heart's content.
Not too far into the construction of the fort, Satiriwa decides to show up with a grand procession of men and women behind him to show his power.
The king was accompanied by 700 or 800 men, handsome, strong, well-made, and active fellows, the best trained and swiftest of his force, all under arms, as if on a military expedition. Before him marched 50 youths with javelins or spears, and behind these, and next to himself, were 20 pipers who produced a wild noise without musical harmony or regularity, but only blowing away with all their might, each trying to be the loudest. Their instruments were nothing but a fixed sort of reeds, or canes, with two openings, one at the top to blow into, and one at the other end for the wind to come out of, like organ pipes or whistles. On his right hand limped his soothsayer, and on his left hand his chief counselor, without which two personages he never proceeded on any matter whatever.
Among other observations Lemoyne makes of Satira is his many wives and people fanning him on hot days. Satira isn't some well-spoken Algonquian sachem elected by the women in his village, or likewise by the Iroquois people to be a peace chief on the Grand Council. This far south, it seems like there is a larger power dynamic and more social distinction among native cultures. And Satira was a genuine chief or king of sorts. He belonged in a different class than everyone else. And you can hear it and see it in these descriptions. And the Europeans at first were very scared because, again, it appeared they were on the warpath. And no matter how many arms they don't have the numbers that Satira has. Fort Caroline isn't built yet, not completely. And so at first the French recoiled until it became clear that this was more of a parade and less of a military invasion. Nonetheless, Satira wanted to impress the Europeans with his show of force, his large numbers, and his musicians. Laudonnière invited him into the fort, and Laudonnière decided that he would in return try to impress himself upon Satira.
Satira was terribly frightened himself at the sound of the drums and the trumpets, and of the reports of the brass cannon which were fired.
Now it's clear from this French account that Satira, once in the fort and surrounded by the machinations of the Europeans, realized he was outclassed. The instruments were louder, they would resonate with one another, there was more organization in terms of music theory, but then there were also the loud cannons, which he probably had never heard before. He probably heard them shoot off primitive guns, but a cannon would make quite an impression around him. He would notice the tools and the different types of structures the Europeans were attempting to build. He deduced that these people could be useful to him as long as they stayed friendly. And so his people began to help build the fort. And after being so welcoming and rendering so much service unto the French, Satira says, "I'm going on the warpath against those people who have this silver and gold that you desire so much. We have made an alliance, and so you must go to war with me." Again, Laudonnière didn't quite understand this part of native culture. If you're in an alliance with really any native group along the North American coast, the East Coast anyway, an alliance infers military support. It's not simply, I trade with you, you trade with me, I'm at peace with you, you're at peace with me. There's also this requirement that you help in times of war. And Laudonnière, not quite set up, not quite settled in, a little weary of Satira and his accounts of what the outside world looks like in and around now French Florida, supposedly, says no. He says, we're not ready for the warpath just yet. Why don't you come back a couple months, maybe a year later from now? But right now, we're really just trying to get ourselves settled in. Thank you, but no thank you. Satira is not happy with this. He doesn't try to hide his emotions here. He is very disappointed. He's very angry, and the French not understanding what this alliance meant may have spoiled all of his plans. And so for Laudonnière, Satira becomes now a potential problem. The French find 2 Spaniards living among Satira's people, probably castaways, runaways, who knows? And the Spaniards say, no. This silver isn't coming from far away. This gold isn't coming from far away. Not to the west, not up in the hills, not in the mythical town of Appalachia. This is coming from Spanish shipwrecks off the coast that the natives pillaged through. The cracks in Satira's story are already starting to form. Satira and his people decided to go to war with or without the French. However, Satira invited the French to observe his parting ceremonies, his preparations for war.
He assembled his men, decorated, after the Indian manner, with feathers and other things, in a level place. The soldiers of Laudonnière being present, and the force sat down in a circle, the chief being in the middle. A fire was then lighted on his left, and 2 great vessels full of water were set on his right. Then the chief, after rolling his eyes as if excited by anger, uttering some sounds deep down in his throat, and making various gestures, all at once raised a horrid yell, and all his soldiers repeated this yell, striking their hips and rattling their weapons. Then the chief, taking a wooden platter of water, turned towards the sun and worshipped it, praying to it for a victory over the enemy, and that, as he should now scatter the water that he had dipped into a wooden platter, so might their blood be poured out. Then he flung the water with a great cast up into the air, and as it fell down upon his men, he added, "As I have done with this water, so I pray that you may do with the blood of your enemies." A fire was kindled near the bank of the river, and 2 large vessels of water were placed beside it. Here Saturiwa took his stand, while his chiefs crouched in the grass around him. And the visages of 500 warriors filled the outer circle, their long hair garnished with feathers and covered with the heads and skins of wolves, cougars, bears, and eagles. Saturiwa, looking towards the country of his enemy, distorted his features into a wild expression of rage and hate, then muttered to himself, then hoveled
an invocation to his god, the sun, then sprinkled the assembly with water from one of the vessels, and then turning upon the fire suddenly quenched it. So he cried, "May the blood of our enemies be poured out, and their lives extinguished." Satira intended to go to war with one of his neighbors further inland, a chief by the name of Utana, who maybe had more villages under his control than Satira himself. But unknown to Satira, the French already sent some of their own men to meet this Utana. Laudonnière sent out Lieutenant Otigny to discover the truth of these rumors of gold and silver upriver further inland to the west. And the last the French have heard of the lieutenant, he found some natives who didn't have gold or silver, but knew people to the west that did, and so he left with them and hadn't been heard from since. Weeks went by. Obviously concerned, Laudonnière sent out a sergeant and a captain to find the lieutenant. And when they did find him, he was living in a native village, and he had 5 or 6 pounds of silver on him, and seemed in no hurry to be going anywhere. This lieutenant was clearly out for his self-interest. This lieutenant found himself in one of the villages under the control of Utana, the chief they were seeking out. Utana claiming to have 40 villages under his command, and, from the French perspective, believed to have lived closer to the sources of gold and silver, these Frenchmen decided to make an alliance with him. Which brings us back to Fort Caroline and Laudonnière, because Laudonnière made an alliance with Satira. And then a couple of his underlings made an alliance with Utana. And Satira and Utana were bitter enemies. Laudonnière, having no experience with managing two contradicting positions like this, could only stall requests from allies and deny things and lie to keep up the ruse. But in reality, both alliances seem to have canceled each other out. And in fact, to make any of these alliances valid at this point, the French would really have to show up with force to support one side or the other. One of Laudonnière's weaknesses is his lack of conviction and willingness to let his underlings decide things and have a say in things. But at this time, and in this moment, you need a smart leader who can make singular decisions very quickly. And Laudonnière is not that guy. And his hand would be forced by the actions of the natives themselves. So Satira went to war with Utana, raided one of his villages, killed a whole bunch, scalped and dismembered a bunch of people, and took 24 captives, bringing them back to parade in front of the French, and of course their own people. The French observed these trophies of war, which of course were the captives, but also dismembered heads, scalps, arms, and legs. These were literal trophies of victory. And this tradition of trading these trophies back and forth among allies is found all the way up and down the eastern seaboard of North America. It's a very common native thing to do at the time. This all takes place in late August of 1564, so things are escalating quickly here. So Laudonnière says to Satira, "Could I have a couple of your captives? We're in an alliance with one another. I would like a couple of your captives." Now, this wouldn't be an absurd request. If they were genuine allies, like I said, things move around. Things are traded as gifts. Even people can be a gift. Satira refused, and he said, "When you didn't want to go to war with me, our alliance was over." And Satira had reason to be suspicious. Laudonnière planned to take those captives of Utana and return them back to him, confirming their alliance and confirming that Laudonnière was indeed going to choose Utana rather than Satira to be his ally, Utana being probably slightly more powerful and again closer to the mineral wealth. At this point, again, Laudonnière's hand is forced because now he understands that native alliances depend on military support. He gets this now. So Laudonnière takes 20 of his strongest men, armed with guns. They go to Satira's own village, the main village. They go into his own house, and Laudonnière sits in his chair. The Timucua had rounded structures, not like a wigwam, wickiup, or igloo, more like a cone shape for the walls and the structure itself, with a thatched roof on top. And Satira's dwelling was, of course, at the center of the village and larger than everyone else's. And his chair was a throne of sorts. So Laudonnière sitting in his chair isn't just a guy sitting in a chair. It's a man assuming the power that the chair is associated with. And this led to a tense standoff where you have 20 armed European men with guns versus thousands of natives without guns. Now this right here could be the end of our tale of French Florida, but it was not. While the old men had their standoff, it was one of Satira's sons who said, "Hey, I got a couple of these captives myself. These are my captives. I can do with what I please. I'm going to give them to the French. And it was Satira's son who diffused the situation and handed over a couple of Utuna's men to the French. And while there was no bloodshed, this tense moment was pivotal to the French at Fort Caroline. They were declaring that the alliance with Satira was dead, obviously, and that they were now confirming their alliance with Utuna.
The Saturiwa Conservation Area on the St. Johns River is crawling with wildlife, including many rare and protected species, rich in ecological diversity and artifacts illustrating northeastern Florida's dramatic history. Next time, we continue the saga of 16th century Protestant settlements in the territory of Florida. I'm Mark Vinette, and I hope you're enjoying the ride.